Let me introduce Julie Roseland. She is part of the Davidson group. She's our affiliate partner in the Raleigh-Durham market, but she just recently signed up a new client in Boise, Idaho. So we are not limited, particularly these days when everyone's getting used to doing business by Zoom and by using remote workers and partners. And so Julie, I invited Julie to join to make sure that what I tell you is correct and to get me out of a jam if you ask a question I don't know the answer to. So Julie, I'm happy to have you here with us, and thank you very much. This is not going to be a PowerPoint type presentation. But I do have a couple of slides at the very beginning I want to share with you, and then we'll go from there. Let me see if I can share the screen here. Okay, hopefully you can see this slide. The first thing is what the Davidson Group is not. We are not a law firm, and none of us are attorneys. So we don't give legal advice. And so don't take anything we say today as being legal advice. So we'll talk about some things that border on, that are related to laws and employment laws. But for legal advice, you need to consult with an attorney who specializes in employment law. If you do not have a relationship with one of those, reach out to us. We know quite a few really good ones, and we'll be happy to refer some to you. As Holly said, we are an HR services provider that helps small and mid-sized organizations build the most engaged and productive workforces possible while remaining compliant with local and federal requirements. So local, state, and federal requirements. So that's the end of this disclaimer. We're here to answer your questions, and so your questions are going to get priority over anything else. But I also know from experience that sometimes when you have these types of meetings, no one really comes with questions. And so I created some topics that I'm going to cover. And if you don't see them here, please let us know if there's something you would like to talk about during this hour. We're going to talk about COVID-19 leave and the FFCRA as we enter this first quarter of 2021. I'm prepared to talk about COVID-19 vaccines and whether you should require them or not, and if you do, how to go about it. Prepared to talk a little bit about what we might expect from a Biden administration in terms of Secretary of Labor, National Labor Relations Board, things like that. And then another topic that we seem to get a lot of questions on is, now that we have more remote workers, how do we manage them better, and how do we hire virtually and bring people on board virtually? So those are the things that I'm prepared to talk about, and unless you interrupt me, I'm going to just start blathering about those topics. Okay, so let's start with this COVID-19 leave. I want to take a little survey very quickly. Holly, are you prepared to put the little survey question up? Okay, so quick poll. Which of the following is true? We are continuing to pay our employees up to 80 hours of COVID leave per the FCRA in 2021. We stopped providing that benefit when the FFCRA expired on December 31st. And the FFCRA either didn't apply to us, or we're really not sure what we're going to do. We haven't had to make that decision yet. There's no wrong answer. It's just, I'm just curious as to what companies are doing. So take a second and make your selections. And Holly, whenever you're ready, you can show us what the trends are.
We'll give you guys just another second to get your last minute votes in if there's anybody that hasn't voted that still wants to.
So about half of you are continuing to honor the FFCRA provisions. One firm has went ahead and stopped doing that. And then some of you either don't apply or you're not really sure. Okay, thanks, Holly. That's about what I expected. So if you're not sure exactly what I'm talking about, the FFCRA was introduced back in the spring, and it enabled 2 weeks or up to 80 hours of required paid sick leave for employees of employers with fewer than 500 employees, I believe it was. And that it technically expired on December 31st. However, has been extended to some degree as a voluntary program through March 31st. So what that means is that companies can continue to provide that leave, that paid leave for their employees, and continue to get tax credits for that through March 31st, but it's not mandatory. The main thing I would say to organizations is that you just have to be consistent. That's the hard part about this, is that because everyone's story is different in terms of, and I've seen a lot of organizations that are extending that leave to people that may not have met the requirements specifically as FFCRA, but they just don't want them coming to work. And so you can talk to your CPA about how that applies to your situation. But in general, it's not required that you continue to pay them, but a lot of my clients seem to be choosing to do that because for an employee relations situation, which is, hey, if I had been lucky enough to get COVID back in November, I would have gotten 2 weeks of pay. But since I didn't get it until January, now I'm having to take 2 weeks without pay. Those types of things that employers are thinking about. So Julie, did you have anything to add to that situation or that topic?
You summarized it well. The one other point I would emphasize is that it is not a new bucket going into 2021. So for example, I have a client that the cases started to hit at the end of the year. And so it's just popping up a lot now. And we had the first 2 employees the week between Christmas and New Year's. And so they only used a certain amount of time, like 8 hours in one case, 16 hours out of that 80-hour bucket. That client decided to continue it voluntarily. The tax credits are still available to them, but those employees only have the amount of the bucket left that they did not already use in 2020.
That's a great point. Thank you for bringing it up. If you had an employee take their 2 weeks, in July or August because of a family member or whatever, and then they have another situation pop up now, they would not be eligible to take another 2 weeks of that according to the FFCRA. Okay, so there's that. Were there any questions about COVID leave or how to handle that going forward? We're not making a specific recommendation as to whether you should or should not. We just help our clients think through the ramifications, both financial ramifications and employee engagement types of ramifications as they make decisions. And then our advice is that, make your decision. We're either going to do it through March 31st or we're not, or we're going to do it through January 31st and we're going to stop, or whatever you're going to decide. And then treat all your employees the same as it comes to requesting that time off or needing it. Okay, well, let's move on to another topic of interest, which is COVID vaccines. A lot of the questions we get from our clients are related to COVID vaccines. Particularly, the question is, can we require our employees to be vaccinated? The short answer to that question is yes, you absolutely can mandate that your employees be vaccinated. Whether or not that's a good idea depends on your industry, your particular situation, and you always have to make certain accommodations. People that have disabilities or they're currently on medication that their physicians may determine is not a good fit for the vaccine. You have to make accommodations for those folks. And then deeply held religious beliefs. A question that comes up occasionally is, well, I have an employee that just doesn't like vaccinations anyway, doesn't believe in them, doesn't give their children vaccines for measles and other things, and they're refusing to take the vaccine. What do I do about them? Do they qualify based on the religious objection? Most of what I've read, and again, if you have this situation, it might be a good time to confer with your labor attorney just to, before you act. But most of what I'm reading for general knowledge is that it's the religious accommodation is a pretty high bar for employees to meet, and anti-vaxxers are generally not considered a religious group for the purposes of religious accommodation. So you probably can continue to require a person, if they want to work here, they have to be vaccinated if that's what you choose to do. You know, should you do that or not is really a company by company decision. Normally, the EEOC uses language like, we encourage people to get a flu vaccine, for example, rather than they require people to get a flu vaccine. They left that encourage out of their most recent guidance. And so they're being a little stronger in term, it seems, that's how it's interpreted. But they are saying that this vaccine is not a medical exam under the Americans with Disability Act, which means that, you know, we have a little more flexibility as employers to do this type of thing and require this type of thing. I think we had a question. Julie, what's going on out there?
We sure do. A question came in. What are the employees' options for denying the vaccine? Once again, what are the employees' options for denying the vaccine?
I think they would have to, first of all, if they have an Americans with Disabilities Act, if they're covered under that in a way that would exclude them, then they're fine there. Otherwise, they probably just have to talk to their employer, state their case, and see if the employer will honor their commitment. You know, if you work in the emergency room at a hospital, they may say, you know, we don't care that you don't trust it. You think it was developed too quickly. You know, we're requiring this. They may choose to give you an alternative position in a different part of the hospital where you're not patient facing. But I think that the employee option is really just to talk to your employer, express your concerns, and see if you can work something out. And that's always the best option. Do you have anything to add to that, Julie?
The only thing I would say is, once you make that decision as an organization to either recognize this employee's objections and move them into a different position, or whatever you do, close that up, document it, put it in the file, make sure that you can point to a clear process that you walked through to determine whatever the end result is.
Yeah, excellent advice. Another piece of advice I've seen in articles that I've read from attorneys is if you determine that you're going to require them, they really encourage you to use a third party, you know, like a CVS or Walgreens or someone like that to administer these, or Cone Health, or, you know, whoever you can engage to come out and do on-site work. But even if you have a company nurse or you know, medical people on staff, the recommendation is to not administer these yourself, but to use a third party. And most of it has to do with that privacy thing Julie mentioned earlier, which is letting that organization collect the questionnaires, because I'm sure they're going to be asking you certain questions, health screening type questions before they give you the vaccine. And it's really better for you if a third party's collecting those than if the company's collecting those and the company nurse is administering the vaccines. And so that's one of the recommendations out there.
Mark,
go ahead.
I'm just going to interject here real quick. We got another comment. Consistent use of documented processes is key.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amen.
Yeah.
Exclamation point. Quite right.
Yeah. And so if you're going to adopt a policy related to COVID vaccines, you may go ahead and write it yourself, or engage someone like us to help you write it, or an attorney. You know, I think you want to consider, before you decide that you're going to have sort of a zero tolerance or you're going to mandate it, consider the type of business you're in, consider the nature of the interactions that your employees have with others, the nature of your clients. Like if you're a home health agency or a home care agency that deals with the elderly, you may have a different perspective than a manufacturing facility that has 30 or 40 employees that are scattered around the plant most of the day. So you may have you just have to think about your particular situation, how your employees are going to react to the mandate. And consider the consequences if you draw a hard line. What if your top sales representative is one of these people that just doesn't comfortable taking the vaccine? Are you prepared to let your top sales rep go? And you don't want to be in a position where you're having to rewrite your policy once your top sales rep says they're not going to take the vaccine. They'll go work for a competitor first. Think through those whole scenarios before you come up with your plan. And I think you have a little time. The vaccines are making their way, but it's going to be a little while before they're so readily available that you're having to make this type of decision. Most companies I talk to are not going to require the vaccine, but they're going to heavily encourage it. They may offer incentives to people to get it done, to celebrate all those that have gotten the vaccine or whatever. But again, you have to, it's a case by case basis. Julie, you have anything to add to COVID vaccines?
No, other than stay tuned and keep watching.
I plan to mine when I can, so hopefully you will as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, in the absence of any questions from the group, I'll move on to the third topic, which is the new administration. Anytime you have a new administration in office in Washington, you're going to get a new set of cabinet members, and those cabinet members and those cabinet positions have the potential to have huge impact quickly on those of us out here in the workforce and in, whatever. So they can move much more quickly than, say, Congress can typically, and they have some flexibility because most laws are written such that, one of the agencies actually administers all the fine points. So you can expect some changes effective January 20th and in the first quarter and first year of the Biden administration. And I'll give you a little preview of some of the things that I'm sort of expecting to happen. I don't have a crystal ball, but anything could happen. One of the things that I'm hearing is that OSHA may come out with a national emergency standard within days of the inauguration. What does that mean for us? Well, right now we have, as businesses, we have all this CDC guidance and we have all these things, and we're all scrambling to try to make sure that we keep our people safe, but we're keeping our doors open if we can and all of that. Well, if OSHA comes out with a standard, now it's, rather than a CDC recommendation, there could be things there for which we will be held accountable and potentially fined for. So that's a big step forward for OSHA if they indeed do this. So that's something to pay attention to. If it becomes an OSHA standard, it's a little different than a CDC recommendation. So you don't really have the option of deciding whether you're going to do it or not, any more than you have the option of having people work in an unsafe environment in your plant or on your construction site. So stay tuned for that.
And Mark, I'll just interject. There is some precedent for that in that California has already, I've got some clients with California employees, and of course, that's a whole other employment law planet out there. And sometimes you can look at California to see what our future might hold. And California already has some specific requirements in place, including procedures, written COVID plans for California employers. So as Mark says, stay tuned and pay attention.
It'll be really no different than like several of my clients use respirators regularly, and we have to have a respirator program. We have to have respirator testing, and we have an entire respirator safety program, if you will. And so for those of you that have safety manuals and safety handbooks, if this becomes an OSHA standard, then you'll want to add a chapter to your safety handbook. The next thing that I expect is a pretty quick rescinding or undoing of Trump's executive order, which bans certain types of diversity training for federal agencies and contractors. That'll be rescinded fairly quickly. The Trump administration banned those because they had gotten word that certain types of these training were a little more aggressive toward what they perceive to be stereotyping or scapegoating certain types of people in terms of American history, and they didn't like that. So he just put a ban on all of it. The Biden administration will rescind that ban fairly quickly. And if you're a government contractor, you'll be able to go back to providing diversity inclusion training, unbiased, what's the phrase I'm looking for? Unconscious bias type training, things like that, without any issue. I would just say, and this is just a personal note, if you're going to use a third party for this type of training, and the Davidson group doesn't provide this type of training. I'm a white guy over 50. They won't let me, it's not legal for me to teach. I'm kidding. But if you are going to use a third party for this type of training, really investigate them and their basic philosophies. I was an early adopter of diversity training in the late 80s. I think it's excellent. It can really help your organization if done properly. Some of the newer providers have a little bit more of a political edge to their presentations and have a little more of an axe to grind. And the result of that type of training can be alienation of your white workforce. So just do some research and find out what their goals are and the approach that they take, and bring it back online if it makes sense for your organization. The next thing has to do with the new Secretary of Labor. President-elect Biden nominated Marty Walsh, who's the current mayor of Boston, or a former mayor of Boston, for that post. He'll have to go through all the hoops before he actually gets confirmed. But no matter who ends up as the Secretary of Labor, they're going to reflect the President-elect Biden's platforms. And so you're going to see a lot more sort of a pro-union, pro-employee, which means by definition, difficult sometimes for employers. So it's a great time to go back and review if you're subject to union pressure, it's a great time to go back and look at your union avoidance plan. If the Biden National Labor Relations Board brings back some of the quickie election rules that were under consideration during the Obama administration, then you certainly have to be prepared, because things can happen really quickly with those regulations and rules in place. So if you're concerned about unionization or pressure from labor unions, you probably want to go back and rethink what you're doing. My philosophy has always been companies generally get the union they deserve. And so the best way to avoid unions is to be a great employer. And if your employees don't consider you a great employer, then try to figure out how to become a better employer. And that's the best defense. But there are other more specific things that you can do in a union avoidance strategy. Julie, anything there?
No, I love that. I love that. The universe sends us what we need all the time. So try to be a good employer so you don't invite that correction.
Yeah, exactly. We expect wage and hour enforcement to be a little more aggressive over the next 4 years. And so we may get some additional guidance. Traditionally, if we look at California as an example, the use of contractors has been really scrutinized. And so if you have a lot of 1099s going out to people that really work for you full time, this may be a really good time to review that, because that is one of the areas where employers face the greatest monetary risk is in the misclassification of contractors. And I can explain that to you if you want to contact me, why that's a big risk. Does that mean it's always inappropriate? No, there's certainly times where having someone on 1099 makes perfect sense, and it meets all the IRS and Department of Labor scrutiny without a problem. But sometimes I see it where it's quite questionable. I've seen it where people use it as part of their 90-day probation period. We're going to put you on contract for the first 90 days and then roll you off and things like that. And you don't want to go there. The wage and hour stuff, and also exempt, non-exempt. This is a good time to review that. As a HR manager who was a party to a fairly large settlement with the government about 15 years ago, due to, not my error, but due to a company's insistence on its labeling certain positions exempt when the Department of Labor ultimately disagreed. People, in my experience, are pretty quick to label a position exempt. And when I issue warnings about those particular roles, I'm often dismissed by the client. But until you've sat across the desk from that DOL person who's asking you the really hard questions, you may not really understand what the risk is going to be. So if you have a lot of folks listed as exempt just because it's convenient for you and it's just easier, now's a good time to take a look at whether they really do qualify to be exempt or not. Or you'd much rather someone like us do it for you than to have someone from Raleigh do it for you. Julie, you have anything to add there? And when I say someone from Raleigh, I don't mean Julie. I mean somebody from one of those big red brick buildings.
I actually had this conversation with a client last week, and I was reviewing with them that the test is twofold. It's not just whether they meet the salary threshold, but also the duties. And in this particular instance, we've not worked through the whole process yet, but I suspect it's going to be pretty gray. It's a new position for them. It's a hybrid position for them. This person is going to be doing some inspection duties. How much of that will include independent decision making? What is the financial impact of their decisions? There's a lot of different checklists. There's good tools out there. But you have to remember, first and foremost, it's not just a let's look at the salary. Are they making X, then check? That's not it. You've got to look at the salary and the duties. And then in this particular instance that I'm citing, I think it's going to come down to the percentage of time this new position is doing on-site maintenance work versus higher level administrative work.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that where clients and people who consult with me about these types of matters get hung up very often is the phrase you just described, which is the level of decision-making they have, independent decision-making, but the next phrase is on matters of significance. And in my experience and talking to people from the Department of Labor and having gone through this myself, employers tend to set a much lower bar for what is matters of significance than the Department of Labor tends to place the bar for what is matters of significance. So that's where people get hung up, which is, my accounts payable clerk makes more than the salary threshold, and she decides which clients are going to get paid, this check run or next check run or whatever, and she has quite a bit of discretion in how she performs her duties, but the Department of Labor would say, well, but she doesn't have the decision to just not pay a bill. She's not going to be able to just not pay bills, without checking with you or whatever. And they would not consider that a high enough threshold of matters of significance to meet the standard. So, we can certainly help organizations think through that, and or there's other resources out there as well that can help you with that.
And I'll just put in an additional plug. I think Mark's earlier point of it's nice to have that record of an independent group or individual going in and doing an audit and providing some findings for you. That type of documentation is very helpful to have on file.
Yeah, it shows a good faith effort on your part that, you know, you didn't just willy-nilly assign someone to be exempt or non-exempt. Well, there's never a problem putting somebody non-exempt, but you didn't willy-nilly put somebody in an exempt role, but you actually did your best to try to make sure you're being compliant. So good point overall. Do we have any more questions or anything that's come up? No? All right. I'm going to keep on chatting then. The next thing we're going to talk about is less about compliance and more about employee engagement and just keeping a good, solid workforce. One of the things that COVID did was create an environment where remote work was necessary. And so a lot of employers who prior to COVID would have been very negative about the potential of having people work from home, work remotely, were put in a position to where they had to accept some of that. And so attitudes have changed to some degree. I've seen it go both ways. I've seen people that were previously more of that sort of theory X type manager that said, well, if they're not sitting at their desk, they're not working. And I don't want them, if they're at home, all they're going to do is, you know, play with their dog and do all this and not get work done. But now I'm convinced that my employees are committed to the company and committed to the mission, and I can trust them to work from home, work remotely, and be productive, and their attitudes have changed. I've seen others that got burned, people they thought would do a good job working remotely, all of a sudden became very poor performers and couldn't get their work done. And so now they're really soured on remote work in total. And I would suggest that the best approach to take on deciding whether to let some of this remote work extend on through the time when COVID is behind us is it's really a case-by-case thing. Some employees also thought they would love working from home. And then when they found themselves in a position where they had to, because the office was closed down, they found that they hated it and they couldn't be productive, and there were too many distractions, and they just weren't disciplined enough to do that. And they needed and preferred to get up, go into work every day, you know, into their workspace. Other employees who thought they would hate it have found that they kind of like it. Hey, they're able to be productive. They can work around certain things in their life and still get their productive work done. So it really varies by company and by employee. So I wouldn't suggest that you embrace it 100% either way. Like don't cancel all your leases and decide you're going to have a completely remote workforce, because some people may not be productive in that manner. And don't, just because one or two people didn't perform well, decide you're not going to allow anyone to work remotely once we get through COVID. I think that I'm starting to add into newer handbooks that I'm writing a remote work policy, which tells the employee what the process is for determining whether your position is one that can be considered for a remote assignment or not, and how we go about deciding, and how we can decide at any time that it's not working and bring you back in, those types of things. And so I think that's a good idea to have some type of policy related to remote work if you're going to allow it. And when it comes, one of the things that I'm seeing that employees are complaining about being remote is that when they were in the office, their boss would at least walk by and say hello, good morning, give them some informal updates on what's going on in the company and things like that. And very often when they go remote, the only time they meet with their supervisor is when it's sort of a formal meeting about a formal project, and they lose some of that touch, that human touch that comes from being in the office. Excuse me. So I think that if you're going to have remote workers, you need to take a look at your performance management system for those remote workers. And you need to make sure that you're evaluating their performance, particularly those that are exempt, on output and productivity as opposed to how many hours they're in the chair. Because those that are honest will tell you how many hours they were in the chair, and you can start looking at the anecdotal evidence that, hey, when I call them, they didn't answer, therefore they're not doing anything. But if you have actual quantity and quality metrics you can measure them by in terms of their output, and focus on that, as opposed to just, you know, you get a sour taste because you tried to reach them at 10 o'clock in the morning and you got their voicemail. That may or may not indicate that they're being effective or not. Now with non-exempt workers, you know, you also have to manage their time very carefully and make sure you're very clear on your expectations for them not working overtime and things like that. So clear expectations on quantity and quality of work, availability if you need it, but you know, not so much just based on how many hours they worked for you for exempt people. And don't forget to schedule a Zoom meeting just to say hello, you know, have regular meetings. I've always been a big advocate of something I call tea times, which is when I had direct reports, I always had a weekly tea time with everyone that reported to me directly. And it usually only lasted 5 to 7, 8 minutes. But it was just you know, make sure every single week that we're having some kind of conversation and go on from there, and then schedule more formal meetings for projects we're working on together, things like that. So performance management, engagement with remote workers. Julie, you have anything to add?
I've got a couple things. I would toss out creativity. I am seeing some clients that are getting together and with their teams in small groups outside. Everybody brings their lunch, doing things that are a little bit different so that you can still have that in-person energy that is lost remotely. Secondly, some clear expectations about what channels are going to be used. It might be that your group needs to ensure everybody's on Microsoft Teams. Everyone has training on Microsoft Teams. Maybe you're going to use Slack, some type of other IMing system. And to kind of go along with that, I'm seeing a lot of clients adjusting and updating their expense policies. What are we going to allow for? Do we need to provide stipend for cell phone usage to a whole new group of employees that didn't have access to that in the past? What about standing desks? Are we going to have some sort of a stipend for Wi-Fi coverage? Does that make sense for us to do? And then finally, some sort of documentation, communication to employees that their home office is their responsibility from a safety standpoint. They still have the same obligations. If the laptop falls on their foot while they're working, we might have a workers' comp claim. They still need to report it. And on the flip side of that, they're responsible for ensuring said laptop mine's sitting here on the kitchen counter. It's nice and solid. If I had it on my lap, that would be something different. So some communications about safety and workers' comp for those employees that are now working from home.
Okay, thank you. That's a great point. That's a great point. So transitioning from performance management and engagement for remote workers, I want to sort of back up earlier in the process, which is interviewing, selecting, and hiring and onboarding people remotely, which does bring up a couple of compliance issues, and we'll talk about those first, primarily I-9s. If you're hiring people remotely and they're going to continue to work remotely and your office is closed and it's going to be a while, you know, what do we do about I-9s? Well, we've gotten some guidance that they're being a little more relaxed about that than in the past. And a lot of clients are slack about this, or a lot of my clients, but a lot of companies are slack about this anyway, in terms of the way they collect and maintain I-9 information. But if you're audited on this, which is, the odds aren't really high, but if you are, then you know, it can be pretty embarrassing if you've got a mess on your hands. So it's a pretty simple thing to do right. So there's really no excuse for doing it very poorly. So what do you do now? Because the rules are that the person who signs the I-9 for the employer has to have physically looked at the forms of identification that the employee used to prove that they had eligibility to work in the U.S. So if you're in Greensboro, North Carolina, and you just hired someone in Greenville, South Carolina to be an area salesperson, and in the past they would have driven up for a day or two of onboarding, but now all this is happening remotely, what are you going to do about that I-9 thing? Some people are using Zoom to look at them sort of on the camera, you know, and make a reasonable judgment until such a time comes that you can actually physically look at the document. And if you're doing that, that's fine, but make sure you don't forget to go back and you know, you need to have a tickler list that you did go back, or else you're sort of, you know, you signed that you held it, but you didn't. So you may want to make some kind of note that it was done via Zoom because of COVID and will be collected later. And so that's a challenge. The other thing a lot of folks don't realize is that you can use an agent for this. And I have in the past, when I was head of HR for a national firm and we didn't have the administrative people near people that we were hiring, I would engage a staffing agency or someone like that to help us out. And they would usually just charge me a simple fee to do the I-9 work for me. And so the signature on the page would be from the agent, and that's satisfactory generally. So so there's other options, but we do need to be careful. So I think I saw that we have a question coming in. What do we got, Julie?
We sure do. Question is, do we have to know and abide by labor laws and wage and hour laws in the state the remote worker lives or in the state the company is located? So once again, do we have to know and abide the labor laws and wage and hour laws in the state the remote worker lives, or does the state the company is headquartered in prevail?
That's a great question. And I'll give you an example. For 7 years, I worked in Charlotte, and I lived in Fort Mill, which is a suburb of Charlotte that happens to be in South Carolina. And so every morning I would get up and drive to Charlotte, and I would work in Charlotte. And so at that time, I paid taxes in North Carolina. My withholding taxes were for North Carolina, and the labor laws that would affect me would have been North Carolina labor laws. Now, had I still had that job when all this happened, and I'm now working remotely from Fort Mill every single day, there's a very good possibility that the South Carolina labor laws would take precedent over my situation. And the South Carolina, and I probably should consider changing my withholdings to South Carolina if it's going to be extended period of time. It's a great question for your attorney, as it pertains to your particular situation. But there's a very good chance that remote workers who live in different states, who work out of their home offices or from a local office in their town, are really going to fall under the state laws in which they're working. And so, you need to double check and find out if they have any paid time off requirements that you don't have here in North Carolina, if they have higher minimum wage laws there, other things. And as far as their state withholdings too, those are all things that you need to consider with those remote workers. Hopefully that answered your question. Julie, you have anything to add to that?
You did a great job of pointing out our interesting environment in which employees can go down to Florida to visit with a relative for 2 months. And there needs to be some encouragement, I think, for employers to say, hey, we need to know if you're going to be relocating either on a temporary or you decide to stay in Florida, we need to know about that. I would also connect with your payroll provider, whoever that may be, because they might have some individual suggestions for, the way we address this is X. Bottom line, if you've got one employee who lives and works in California, you got to pay attention to California. and you've got to do all of the things that California law says applies to having an employee in California. And that's a good reason, I think, to connect with Mark and I, because it can be very difficult to keep up with these individual states and the different laws that are in each one. And I'm gonna point out one other area. Mark did a good job of summarizing it, but E-Verify is not required in every state in the US. So you don't necessarily need to put all of your folks through E-Verify if they are in a state that doesn't require it. Kansas is an ideal example.
Yeah, but I generally recommend my folks use E-Verify anyway, because A, it's free, and B, if you have somebody that's not legal, wouldn't you want to know? You know, but to your point, if it's not required and you don't want to go through the administrative exercise of logging in and doing it, there are some states that are there. A lot of you may not know this, but you know, professional athletes, NBA players, NFL players that play games in different states every weekend, you know, they have to file income tax returns in all of those states unless they have some other something else going on I'm not aware of. So it's something that if you have people moving around and working remotely for longer than a few days or a week or two, then it's something you definitely want to research. Hiring, Zoom interviews have been a little different than back when we did face-to-face. I personally think this is a good thing because the data that I've seen and the science that I've seen shows that face-to-face interviews are one of the least valid methods for choosing an employee, and that very often the science shows that companies would really make better choices or just as good of choices if they had never seen the person face to face. They only made the hiring decision off of the interview, off of the resume. And so that's how biased interviews can be. And so Zoom, while you can still see my face and see some hand motions, you know, there a lot of nonverbal communication that you would pick up if I was sitting across from you in a conference room that you're not going to pick up through a Zoom interview. So it's reducing some of that to some degree, the unconscious biases, I think, in particular, but it's not completely, doesn't completely eliminate them. So I think continuing to use other selection criteria, such as online assessments. There's a lot of really good ones out there. You know, improve the validity of your selections. You know, you can have multiple interviewers easier with Zoom, probably than you could back when you tried to herd the cats to get everybody together to interview this candidate who's coming in on Tuesday. And then you find out 3 of the 5 people you wanted them to meet aren't going to be available on Tuesday and all that kind of stuff. So Zoom has its advantages. Zoom and all the other Skype and all the others have the advantages over person-to-person interviews, and some disadvantages as well, because you lose out on some of that nonverbal communication. But seeing people use a lot more of this, and I think it's going to become more mainstream. I was really concerned 15 years ago when video interviews first came out because I was worried about the potential for people claiming discrimination. You know, once you saw how old I was or saw what the color of my skin was, that you would rule me out just based on that. But as it's gaining more in acceptance, I don't have as many concerns about it as I used to. So I'll leave it at that. So those are all the topics I came prepared to discuss. Do we have any topics that we didn't talk about that you wish we had?
I've been watching the Q&A panel, Mark. We don't have any questions coming up through that. Chat seems to be quiet at the moment.
Okay. Well, I'm going to wrap up simply by showing you our contact information. If there's anything we can do to help, feel free to reach out to us. That's our contact information. We'd love to speak with you. And with that, I'll ask Holly if she has anything else that we need to talk about while we have everyone.
All right, well, we're giving you guys just a couple more minutes to type any last minute questions into the chat. I do want to be sure to let everybody know about a new benefit coming soon to GMA. If you enjoy today's program, if you have questions that are need a more in-depth discussion than what we could address today, we are introducing our professional advice hour, and Mark and his company, the Davidson Group, is going to be our professional consultant to offer a free 1-hour HR consultation to any GMA member in good standing. Like I said, the benefits coming soon. You'll be able to find information on our website at mygma.org, where you can submit your information and we will contact you to set up your free confidential HR consultation session. So again, wanted to be sure everyone knew about that. Thank you to Mark. Thank you to Julie for being here today. It's a lot of great information. I know there's a lot going on in your field that we all have lots of questions about. So thank you so much for sharing.
It was our pleasure. We're really excited about the new program in partnership with GMA. And some of you on this call may not be GMA members, but let me give a shout out. It's a great organization. I've been affiliated with it for 7 or 8 years now. Has never disappointed me in terms of the support that this organization provides for its members. It's just a great group, and I'm proud to be associated with it. So we look forward to hearing from you.
All right. Thank you so much, Mark. And yes, if there's anybody on with us that's not a GMA member, you can find out more information and join online as well. We have a lot of webinars like these that are completely free to all employees of GMA member companies.
Thanks for having us, Holly.
All right. Thank you, guys. Unless I see any other questions come in, we will wrap it up. I hope everybody has a good day. And thank you for joining us for our first Teach Me Tuesday of 2021. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.